Hello, distinguished Dr. Stanton and all the distinguished guests. I'm Sonny Chen from National Taiwan University, Asia Pacific Youth Club, and I'm very happy to be here. And I have a question for you, because we've all known from your lecture the significance of the strategy of Taiwan. And I have a question for you. Is Taiwan the core interest of United States? For example, once China attacks Taiwan, what kind of assistance will United States offer to Taiwan, especially under two scenarios? The first scenario is, if Taiwan announces its independence, what kind of assistance will United States offer to Taiwan once China attacks? And the second scenario is, if China just thinks Taiwan postpones the unification as much as possible, then what kind of assistance will the United States offer to Taiwan? Thank you.
Well, you know, again, I can't speak for the United States. I think based on if past is precedent for what we would do now, I think in the event of an unprovoked attack on Taiwan, it's more likely the U.S. would take action. But I think that scenario is increasingly unlikely. I think what's happening increasingly is that Taiwan is becoming more and more economically integrated and otherwise integrated with Beijing. And therefore, I'm not sure, if you will, that there would be any immediate cause for some kind of intervention. It becomes a much more formidable task. I think, you know, if China, your first part of your question was if there's unification, well then, you know, if there's unification, then there's no assistance because Taiwan becomes part of China. I assume you mean to prevent that from happening. I think the policy as enunciated by the U.S. is always that the U.S. will support any agreement that's agreed to by people on both sides of the strait. So I think as long as the consensus is in Taiwan is support the status quo, which is kind of ambiguous, then I imagine our relationship will continue about as it is now. But the question is one of time. How long? I've made this remark in, there is no such thing in a way as a status quo. Status quo always changes. The current situation tomorrow is not the same as the situation today. So incrementally things change. That's the dilemma. It's the dilemma of time, I think, that Taiwan faces on issues like this. You know, it'd be great. Time wouldn't be a question if, in my own view, the biggest obstacle to unification is China is not a democracy. It doesn't have rule of law. It doesn't have transparency in government, and it doesn't have courts subject to review. So if China made those kinds of changes, I suppose there would be, you know, less reason for argument. But that's not the case, and it doesn't seem like it's likely anytime soon.
Okay.
Personal view.
Okay. 好，谢谢。我们这边有罗志正先生来帮我们来提一个问题。
Mr. Stanton, good to see you again, and thank you for reminding us of the importance of Taiwan. To me, I think the importance of Taiwan is also a function of the strategic interaction between the U.S. and China. And so how do you see the prospect of Sino-US relationship, and how do you put Taiwan into perspective? And more importantly, the issue of Taiwan has less and less been mentioned in the Sino-US relationship. And is that a good sign or bad sign for Taiwan?
Well, you know, I predicted, I was asked to speak, I think, just before the U.S. presidential election, and I was asked what was the future for the U.S. There were a lot of mainlanders in the audience, I think, and I was asked, it was kind of a feel-good conference, I was supposed to say positive things, I think, and I was asked what would happen if Romney was elected and what if Obama. I said, well, we know that if Romney's elected, things are going to be immediately bad. Because he's made all these threats, many of which he may not be able to carry out. Obama, initially it would be probably more of the same, but I thought the long-term prospects remain problematic for U.S.-China relations. For one thing, they're both big powers. For another thing, they have very different strategic interests, a very different, in many cases, interests in the resolution of particular issues, and also they don't share the same values. So that makes it very hard for any administration to go that far. So we have currently what goes on, it's no longer a Cold War, but as one author recently described, a cool war, because we trade with China, but in many other ways, we don't have, it's not that warm a relationship. So now the role of Taiwan, I mean, Taiwan is always on the agenda for all the meetings, but it's kind of stale talking points, exchange with stale talking points. In some ways, that's a good thing, because if they start changing the talking points, they make it a lot worse. So I'm happy if the U.S. sticks to the position that as long as there's agreement on both sides of the strait, that's the best defense right now.
Dr. Stanton, thank you very much for your insightful and informative presentation. You often say that Taiwan is strategically really significant to the world and to the United States. But according to my observation, I know that the PRC is meant to unify with Taiwan, and since 2008, the Ma administration is really friendly to Taiwan. And yesterday, at our National Day celebration, President Ma said that cross-strait relations are not international relations. So does that mean we're not two distinct countries? Then maybe he's implying that we are the same country. And I think that President Ma has been supported by the U.S. government, so I'm really frustrated to see this. But obviously, it all depends on our consensus, right? But my question for you is that why is the U.S. government so supportive to KMT and President Ma?
I'm having technical difficulties. Well, I think, first of all, when President Ma says we're part of the same country, it's the old argument that this is a Republic of China. It's the only legitimate government of all of China, including the mainland. It's a position which is, I think, it's kind of too sophisticated for a lot of people to comprehend nowadays. I mean, when I first came to Taiwan in 86, 87, I guess, 86, 87. I mean, at that time, Taiwan had governors and elected representatives to from all the provinces and so forth. So, but once Taiwan moved away from that, and I think that was the debate back at the time, whether it should give up that pretense of representing the entire Chinese nation, I think it's become a more difficult strategy to pursue, simply because when he says we're all one country, I mean, I think President Ma sincerely believes that it's all part of the Republic of China. And I believe he sincerely believes that one day all of the territories of the mainland and Taiwan will all be reunited under the Republic of China. So I understand what he's saying, and if that happens, and it's what everybody wants, I have no problem with that. I don't think Washington, I think the people who know enough about China and know enough about Taiwan understand sort of what he's saying. I think the difficulty is that, I think, as you indicate, that when a lot of people who aren't familiar with that legal argument, that sophisticated argument, they have a harder time understanding that, in fact, doesn't really represent a change in his position. It's a different formulation of it, maybe. So that was the first part. I'm trying to remember the second was, sorry, what was it? Anyone can help me? Does that answer your question?
可以吗？有没有后续的？可以是 OK。
OK。
好，我们这边等一下，张教授，我们等一下，好不好？那后面还有一位，对。
Thank you, Dr. Stanton. I enjoy your speech very much, and according to your speech, it demonstrates that Taiwan's important strategic position is consistent with U.S. interest in Asia and Pacific area. Therefore, my question is to ask you to give your advice and suggestions to Ma Ying-jeou's administrations and next, maybe Tsai Ing-wen's administration, that how to identify Taiwan's international strategic value and to correct the gradual imbalance in its relations between China and the United States at present and in the future. Thank you.
Okay, well, to be fair to Washington, I mean, we have to allow that they also see a strategic interest in trying to maintain some sort of calm in its relations with mainland China. That's clearly also a strategic priority. The thing I think that Taiwan should do, which to some extent I think they've tried to do under President Ma, but I think could be done more, is simply Taiwan needs to integrate itself with other countries, better with other countries in the region. That's why I was very supportive of ideas like a free trade agreement with Singapore, with New Zealand, I guess has been passed. But I'd like to see Taiwan join much more in regional economic agreements that would make Taiwan not so dependent on the Chinese economy. I'd also like to see more outreach to avoid conflicts. As, for example, we saw a fishing rights agreement with Japan. And I guess they're working on one, or maybe it's been agreed to now with the Philippines. But I'd like to see more of those kinds of agreements all the time in many areas to ensure a minimum of any conflicts or disruptions and to improve as much as possible Taiwan's relations with others. You know, Vietnam's an example. I think Taiwan is still the largest investor, foreign investor in Vietnam. And yet, I think relations, I suppose, remain inhibited in part because of the northern neighbor of Vietnam. But, you know, we should be looking at ways that other progress can be made in these relationships. Well, I hope that's one of the things our center will be working on.
OK， 好，张教授。
Your recognition of Taiwan's strategic importance certainly very reassuring. I wish there are more people in your government or your former government in the Obama administration see things the same way. Of course, Hillary Clinton, Cole Campbell, they well recognize that Taiwan's strategic importance. Yet there's a gap between what they say and the actual action by the Obama administration. If they really see the importance of Taiwan, why, well, certain kind of a strategic defensive weapon that Taiwan needs, they would not provide to Taiwan. And of course, Taiwan like to be in the TPP, yet the United States has not been very enthusiastic, or at least not makes it easy for Taiwan to be in the TPP. I have a question as to if there's a different administration here in Taipei and different from Kuomintang, and we want to stay free and independent from China, then what Taiwan can do in Washington to really convince that, well, Taiwan deserves U.S. support to remain free and independent from communist China? Thank you.
Well, as we saw during the last election, that's hard to do. When there was a strong leak out of Washington critical of, at that time, Chairwoman Tsai. I think, to be fair, I think as I know the DPP's been working for some time on developing its China mainland policy. I think one thing that would help the DP a lot, both with voters but also in Washington, is to have a clear statement of what that policy is going to be. Now, I know China doesn't make it easy, because China has always says, well, if you agree to these principles, then we can talk. It was like Henry Kissinger in Beijing. If you agree to these conditions, then we can have an agreement. I think it's a difficult question. I think the main thing is kind of to continue to have maximum contact with Washington officials, to continue doing the best job you can to convey your views, but also you have to constantly persuade Washington that you're not going to upset the apple cart. Washington's always afraid that some action or statement will be made that will precipitate a crisis. And Washington is crisis adverse, except for those crises it causes itself, like the current budget crisis. So, I think there's lots of things Taiwan could do too. Taiwan could to take some steps towards economic liberalization, even while it presses Washington to come out a statement expressing support for Taiwan joining the DPP, joining the TPP. So I think there needs to be more effort on both sides. It's no easy answer to any of these things. You mentioned Kirk Campbell and Hillary Clinton. Two people don't make a government. As powerful as they are, as important as they were, they didn't necessarily decide what our policies would be.
好，看看各位还有没有其他问题？好
，Back there hasn't asked the question.
好，对不起，后面对，好 ，OK， sorry.
That's all right. All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Stanton, for your presentation. I'm Abraham Gruber, a student at National Taiwan University in the Political Science Department. And what I'd like to ask you about is one thing that I found very interesting in the classes that I've taken here is a different view of the strategic importance of Taiwan to the United States that I've been exposed to while I've been here. And my understanding of the view that you've just presented, I would say that a lot of what you were discussing is the importance of Taiwan as a military asset, either to the PRC or to the United States. But this view would more emphasize the importance of Taiwan either as a bargaining chip or as, in a sense, a button the United States can push to influence China. According to this view, the reason why the United States cares about Taiwan is because the United States cares about China and about Chinese foreign policy. And China really cares about Taiwan, whether it's from strategic considerations or from considerations of nationalism or for other reasons. It's a very important part. It's very central to Chinese foreign policy. And because Taiwan is extremely important to China, even perhaps in a not entirely rational way, so the United States can put forth very little energy or resources and use Taiwan to influence China. So, for example, when there was the crisis in 2001 with the plane crash in Hainan Island, the United States that month announced several major arms sales to Taiwan. And that could possibly be interpreted as sort of punishing China for its behavior. And from the perspective of this view, the strategic ambiguity that the United States maintains on the Taiwanese question could be viewed as maintaining that particular strategic value of Taiwan. So on the one hand, the United States would not be willing to give Taiwan a very clear strategic commitment, or to draw its relations with Taiwan too close, because that would reduce the potential of the United States to use that as a tool to influence China, or as a threat to influence China. But then on the other hand, the United States also very much cares about Taiwan's future, would not lightly allow Taiwan to be annexed or to be taken over by the People's Republic of China for similar reasons. Now, the question that I would like to ask Dr. Stanton is just twofold. So first, in your view, especially given your experience working in the United States government, has this kind of a perspective been a factor in past U.S. policy toward Taiwan? And the second question is, in your view, would it still be a factor today? Thank you.
Okay, well, I think the simple answer is no. I mean, Taiwan, as I've made clear, was basically seen as an obstacle to doing what the U.S. wanted to do in '72, to try to establish some kind of relationship with China. To be a real bargaining chip, it would have to work both ways, that the U.S. would both be willing to give up any support for Taiwan, totally abandon it, or that it would send troops in again. And I've never heard anyone discuss those thoughts or options in that range of possibility. It's been much more limited ever since. I think that, you know, back in 1972, when China was incredibly weak, I think the United States could have, if we knew really what we were doing, if there had been U.S. interpreters and key advisors who knew something about the history of China in the room, we might have gotten a much better deal, and Taiwan might have gotten a much better deal than it did. I mean, Kissinger didn't even seem to have noted that the whole first day, the discussions, as we now know from the records were released, were devoted to Taiwan by Zhou Enlai. So I don't think we've ever really we've used China as a chip against Russia. Taiwan has been sort of something we had to think about what we were going to do after we broke relations. I mean, it was only the Taiwan Relations Act from the Congress that said, well, we've got this country, what are we going to do with it? We've got to deal with it. So I've never heard discussions like that. I'm not sure about, you know, 2000, when you mentioned an incident in 2001, I'm not sure about any connection between arms sales but one of the problems we have with arms sales is these days is not so much, it's partly what the U.S. will or will not sell, but it's also a question of how much effort Taiwan also, as I've said publicly before, puts into its defense budget, how persistently and consistently it pursues certain kinds of weapon systems. I guess the simple answer is no, I don't think we use Taiwan as a bargaining chip vis-a-vis China, and I don't think it would be a very effective one, because there's no way the U.S. can be true to itself and just walk away, barring a desire on the part of the Taiwan people to unify with with the mainland. I don't think. So I don't think you'd ever hear in a discussion somebody saying that. The biggest problem in Washington is always they tend to stay with the status quo of whatever policy they have, even though they may issue a lot of rhetoric, particularly before elections, about what they're going to do and not do. In general, there's a great deal of inertia in policy towards China and toward Taiwan.
好，我们时间是差不多了，应该已经到，但是有没有人还有没发问，想要第一个发问的？
原来台湾的战略地位是从这个 demographic 来看哈，那现在很多的战争，像说全球化，像很多的现在新的战争，像说是已经发展到太空了。我想好奇美国的好奇号已经登陆火星啊，那也许山寨版的大陆的好奇号10年内可以登陆火星了。那还有这个资讯战争啊，像邻近计划，也许台湾将来是可以部署的。然后或者说这个货币战争，那就说从各种角度来看，已经不是传统就是 demographic 的 significance。那就说台湾未来，尤其各国现在领袖面对就是经济的问题嘛，从美国的这个全民健保。到德国的这个，他要去看整个欧盟的经济，要解决就是经济问题。那台湾在未来这方面是不是可以扮演一些角色？
好，谢谢。
Well, I didn't mean to imply that it's all just military. I think military conflict is probably a lesser likely scenario, but if Taiwan and all of the South China Sea falls under Chinese control, as I said, as many of the states around imperial China did, it has huge political and economic consequences for the world. You know, beginning with Japan, but also for the countries in ASEAN. It also has to do with, you know, so it does have economic implications. I mean, for example, China is very adverse now from the U.S. joining trade agreements or other regional agreements that China has, and is very wary of our agreements. So it doesn't necessarily have to, I'm just saying in an ultimate scenario, you know, the military also has, whatever happens militarily or potentially could have, also has political consequences. You don't, when at the 2010 ASEAN Regional Forum, when the foreign minister of China looked across the table at Singapore and he said, China is a big country and some countries are small, and that's a fact. That kind of statement doesn't have to have a tank rolling up. It's quite clear what he's saying. There's huge pressure that can be brought to bear. So it's certainly true also, as you indicate, that to the extent that Western democracies or Asian democracies like Taiwan and Japan have economic, like Taiwan and Japan and others, Philippines have dislocations and economic problems and are not managing their economies well, have budget problems, that weakens them. There's no question that the most important strength begins at home, that we need to put our own houses in order to have successful foreign policies. If you are seen as chaotic at home and having incoherence in your own domestic affairs, it makes it much more difficult to project any kind of power elsewhere, whether it's hard power or soft power, to make the case that you're serving as a model. So this is a problem all democracies have, because democracies are inefficient. It's much easier in a autocratic state to just tell people, this is what you're going to do. We want to build a freeway here. Get out of your home. It's just going to be built. Here we have to, you know, in America, you have to go through courts. It's messy. It's time-consuming. It's inefficient. But it also means that people are freer. So, you know, that's a dilemma. I don't know if I'm answering your question. It's a very broad-ranging question, but I don't mean to dismiss other kinds of significance. Taiwan remains very important just simply from a point of view of soft power. The fact that it did become a democracy, that it did become a prosperous country. It is a model in many ways for others to follow. So that's important as well. But it's just, I was trying to talk about something that we sometimes call the elephant in the room. It's there, but nobody talks about it. I was trying to talk about the elephant in the room. The fact that there are real strategic interests that people have in what happens here in Taiwan.
OK， 好，我们来谢谢 Stanton 先生今天给我们的演讲。好，我们就到这边结束。好，谢谢。